I'm John Wilbanks. I'm head of data at Astera. I've been in the position since the very end of August. This is the first time that we've talked publicly about the data program. So stay with me and join with me and talk with me as we go. So I'm starting with this concept of the fourth paradigm. This is, I'm going to sort of unpack what this means, and I hate to use the word paradigm in public. It's almost embarrassing. But it actually is a term of art in the sort of scientific theory world, especially the technical world. And it's this idea of data-intensive scientific discovery as the fourth paradigm. So the first three, right, empiricism, theory, simulation. And this is all from a book that Microsoft Research, of all people, published in 2009. And it comes from a guy named Jim Gray, who was a key computer scientist at Microsoft Research and a huge influence on what I've done since then. Jim unfortunately sailed out through the Golden Gate and was never seen again. Around about the same time that he gave the talk that led to this concept of the fourth paradigm. So the idea being that we start with empiricism, observation of the natural world, and that then moves into a theory that lets us make predictions about the natural world from the theory, right? So Newton sits under the tree and thinks very deeply and develops the theory of gravity, and it predicts the world around him. And then in the 1900s, especially after World War II, you start to have early simulation. Not the kind of simulation we have today, but early stage simulations. And starting in the 90s and really accelerating in the aughts, you start to have an overwhelming amount of data that has to be processed by software before it touches a human being. And that is this idea of data-intensive software discovery. Is the first consumer is a machine, not a person. Jim developed this theory of the fourth paradigm from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So if you've never run across the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, it's the Alfred Sloan Foundation, makes a giant grant. This is a redshift survey, right, of the sky. And what's really unique about it is that the budget was 25 to 50% software, even then. Because although you might have 20 to 50 people working full time and you've got a $15 to $20 million machine in the telescope, right, you have people writing thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code to interpret the data. Right? It actually accelerated computer science in the development of the database systems under SQL at Microsoft by a decade. It's a beautiful project, and unfortunately, we don't do everything quite like it these days. And so here's Jim, right, at this last talk. And I love this concept of the instrumentation compared to the software from a CapEx perspective. And this is not something that NASA was ready to fund. NASA was ready to fund the telescope. Sloan, as a private philanthropic foundation, was ready to fund the software, the data storage, and the partnership with Microsoft that actually drove the ability to use the data. This is one of the things that's really unique about the project that I think we should be cloning, copying, right, morphing, and editing. Right? The other thing I think is interesting, this is from a paper by Alex Zale, who wrote with Jim and others. And here, we have very specific queries that have to be answered by the project. So this is not generic feel-good stuff. This is find galaxies with a surface brightness greater than 24 with a major axis, da-da-da-da-da-da. They had 20 of these. And it's one of the best rules of thumb I ever learned was no one has ever built a complex data system by setting out to build a complex data system. You build a complex data system by answering 5 questions at a time using a standards-based approach. And then at the end of 20, you will have a functioning complex data system. Because if you set out to build a complex data system generically, right, you build for the world that is unreal and you solve no problems for no one. And almost always you get your funding cut because no one's answered an interesting question yet. So I tried to extract a couple of lessons, right, from this. And so the first is that the Sloan survey designed data for specific primary use through machines. And then by making it public, it was able to be used in a generic sense for secondary use. But because of the specificity, real problems were solved from the beginning, right? Not vague, generic problems, specific problems. And then the publicness creates the long-term sort of network effect of value from the data. The second is it's a partnership from the beginning between the scientist and the computer scientist. And this is, again, pretty unusual in the way that big science projects get funded, right? You maybe hire a contractor to do the tech. You don't say the computer science is actually as important. And I've seen this in multiple other places where the scientists get stuck and they say, well, it's going to take us a year to build a joint genome call set out of 500,000 genomes. Right? So it's 500,000 genomes against 1 billion variant points. And then you call in a computer scientist who actually understands how to build an array effectively. And for them, it's like a 2-week problem because they know how to use BigQuery effectively. It's this partnership from the beginning that says the way we design the data is actually part and parcel of computer science, right? Not just the science. And then I think this concept that data that is first touched by software. I think all of these things, this is a 15-year-old book and paper. And arguably, these things are more relevant today than when this was written. And so I really encourage you to read it. It's a set of essays, like any book of essays. It's all over the place, right? But if nothing else, read Jim's introductory talk. Now, this is not just a one-time example. So the Protein Data Bank, which is one of the most important resources in biology, is an example of a database that was built in partnership of computer science and biologists. And it was this place where continually you have structures deposited or predicted and computed. And this is potentially relevant because last week the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was granted for work that emerges directly from the Protein Data Bank. And so this concept of data generated from software first, data generated in partnership with computer science, right, has gone from, well, now it's nice that we can actually do the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, to Nobel Prizes are being awarded on the basis of this kind of data. It would have been impossible for AlphaFold to exist in the absence of Protein Data Bank. And so we have this pattern of public data is valuable for specific things and for unexpected generic things over time, right? It generates more value over time than it might be expected to do. And so this concept of data-intensive scientific discovery can't happen without public data. And the government is typically the main place that we do this, right? So the Human Genome Project is one of the canonical pieces of this. In the mid-90s, they had to send a bunch of scientists to Bermuda to argue about how to release the data. May we all be sent to the Caribbean, right, in order to solve data sharing problems. Right? And so these are known as the Bermuda Principles, right? So that the DNA sequence assemblies larger than a kilobyte should be automatically released within 24 hours. Finished sequences should be published immediately, and the entire sequence should be made freely available to the public for research and development. Now, this has become like a canonical piece of open science theory, at least in the life sciences. It's percolated through every other descendant, right, in biology of large public databases. We've had human variation projects, human haplotype projects, and on and on and on, and they all build on this concept. But one of the pieces that's typically not available, if you go look at the Wikipedia entry, they don't talk about the fact that in order to achieve this, they had to give first rights of publication to the academic institutions that held the rights to each chromosome. Right? Because publication in the academy is the coin of the realm, and the ability to be the first to publish the assembly of chromosome 1, chromosome 2, chromosome 3 was a key part of the deal that allowed this public to exist. And it's that connection to publication that I want to keep pulling on through the talk. This is an analysis by Battelle that looked at the downstream impacts of the Human Genome Project, right? So that's 141-to-1 ROI for the public data set that's created here. You can argue with the methodology. I've seen people say it should be higher, it should be lower. But it's pretty hard to argue with the idea that we didn't get a big ROI on this compared to a lot of the other investments we make. I wish we did this kind of analysis more often. Because as we look through our data program at Astera, we're trying to find comparables for this. There's almost no economic analysis of the value of public goods. Right? A lot of us know it intuitively. We were able to sort of go through it, but an actual number that comes from a measurable and viewable report is harder and harder to find. Now, the NIH in the United States has sort of cloned this concept into multiple other versions of the Genome Project, but they've carried it further into things like the Cancer Moonshot, the All of Us Research Program. But I want to contrast these, right, these last two, and I've worked on both of these. I'm a big fan of both of them, I'm not critiquing, right? But I want to contrast the clarity of the goals in the Sloan Digital Sky Survey with the clarity of the goals. We'll start the Cancer Moonshot, right? Increase the pipeline of new cancer drugs. That is a very general goal. It's very different than saying we're going to actually solve a query and make that query possible. It's a generic goal. And so the data that gets created is any kind of generic data that might be able to help you accelerate the pipeline of new cancer drugs. Another one of the goals is to ensure access to current and new standards of cancer care. Right? These are not data-centered goals. And so what you have is in the Cancer Moonshot is you're not actually creating a big public data set about cancer that could be used by anyone trying to cure cancer, in particular to make machine learning models that would help us predict cancer or cancer therapy. The All of Us Research Program, which again I've worked on, is a fantastic program. The idea is we're going to enroll 1 million people who live in America and follow them for a decade. We'll take their blood, we'll take their urine, we'll take their health records, we'll have apps on their phone where they can give us quizzes and surveys, right? And through this, we will build an observational study of health, right, as a backdrop and a back basis. And the idea is it will support thousands of new studies. Now, when times get tough in budget land and there's no specific benefit, what do you think happens to the budget of a $1.6 billion program like the All of Us Research Program? They're facing an 85% net budget cut this year. Right? There's 10,000 people using the data. Right? They're using the data in a very novel technical environment. They're using modern analytic systems. They're building ML and AI models. But none of those answer specific problems that are really relevant to Congress, who decides whether or not to fund this stuff. And so all these kinds of programs sit at risk, right, because of that generic capacity that they're trying to build. And so a lot of this is, how do you build towards generic capacity? Right? I think it should be through specific things built generally. And I think this is part of the problem we have in some of what we do here. I do want to actually compliment one that I think has done it right, which is the Materials Genome Initiative from the Department of Energy. And look at the specificity, right? We want to discover, manufacture, and deploy materials twice as fast. It's a measurable goal, right? It's something you can manage toward. Right? And I've also had to do a lot of management of these projects. And when you're doing project management, it's really good to have a number that you're aiming at, because you know whether or not you're hitting it. I think this is a fantastic project. Not incidentally, this is not mostly routed through academic institutions. This is run through the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the National Laboratory System. And so that's a different sort of federal control system, because it doesn't have to actually put the money into the academic, what I'm going to call the research industrial complex. Because that's the system where we typically get our American money and turn it into scientific knowledge. As we give it to research institutions, we give it to academics, they write papers, the papers get published, and if there is economic value, it goes through the technology transfer system, right? And that's how we get received value back as taxpayers, right? And this is since Vannevar Bush, 1945, through the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, through to today. And the thing is, there's cracks in this system. Right? There's a talk happening right now in the larger one about innovation stagnation. In the blurb for that, it talks about nefarious reasons potentially for the innovation stagnation. I think it's because we encourage people to write very incremental papers in science. It's at least one of the reasons. It's not nefarious, it's the result of a complex system working the way that it's supposed to, or the way that it was designed. Because it helps to be a nation state if you're going to invest in science. So these are budget requests from NSF and NIH, so together about $60.5 billion between the two. Right? You can go and look at the various budget requests. Right? So if you calculate the All of Us Research Program, it's less than, even at $2 billion a year, it's like 2% of the budget, would only be 2% of the budget. I heard this today, that NIH has at least 100,000 funded grants a year. And the vast majority of those, right, go to the research industrial complex. I live in the Boston area. This is Harvard Medical School. Again, don't hate Harvard Medical School. I've been affiliated off and on with it throughout my life. Right? But outside the genome projects and the moonshots, the scholarly publications are the core research output. They're not designed in conjunction with the computational scientists. They don't result in major public data sets. Right? These are individual investigations into basic health biology, materials science, chemistry, physics, all of which is really important. Right? That's how we advance, is through basic science. But you also pay for lots of non-knowledge when you do this. Right? The old joke, at least at MIT, is that if you need to have football for the alumni, parking for the professors, and the ability to hook up for the undergraduates. Right? This is what universities provide. And so you take a 50% haircut on the money you give to an academic institution, at least to pay for overhead. Right? That pays for journals, it pays for all sorts of things at the university. And so when you're doing all of this stuff, right, the local incentive is to maximize publication. And you can do that through novelty. Right? If you're really novel and it's really important, you get a big publication. But most of the time, you get novelty by doing really small novel things. Right? Incremental publications are the easiest things to get funded, and they're the easiest things to publish. And this does not necessarily align with the global incentive to maximize the scientific and/or public good. And this is, again, none of this is new. There's a long-standing movement around this, just to call out exactly what it looks like. So world publications, 2022, NSF estimates 3.34 million. Right? So this is, roughly speaking, you'd need to read a paper every 10 seconds or so to keep up with the research literature. This is a big chunk of why we have a movement around open access to literature, so we can compute it. This is a perfect case for large language models to process and tell us what the literature actually says. And so this whole movement, which I've spent the last 20 years of my life in, around open science. And most of that tends to wind up as open access to the research literature, because that's the visible knowledge product that we want to turn into something computable. I started a company 25 years ago trying to build knowledge graphs out of all the public information that was available about biology, taking all the public data from the US government, and I wound up transferring a huge percentage of the equity I sold into publishers so that I could actually validate whether or not there was something in the abstract that was actually present in the full text, right? And so this has been very successful from a policy perspective. We have convinced the federal government over and over and over again, right? The Holdren memo in 2013, the movement of the NIH, which I'll show you, towards requiring this sort of stuff has been relatively successful. We have a massive open access subset that you can download for text mining and processing into large language models. Estimates are it's as much as half of the literature now is openly available on a sort of year-by-year basis. It's unarguably successful. And it's morphed into this thing about data management and sharing policy. I would also call out that it's not exactly changed the publishing industry. Last year, the publishing industry made $30 billion in the United States off of scientific and scholarly publishing. What we've done is sort of move the blood clot around. And so we're paying an enormous amount of money, but at least the literature is readable by taxpayers and computable. And it's moved into this data management and sharing policy. And this is just NIH. This is very common across all the federal agencies because in 2013, when the White House made the requirement, they required it of all agencies, right? So the Department of Defense has an open access requirement. The Department of Energy has an open access requirement. There are exceptions for national security and other sorts of things. But this is a US concept now. It's part of how we do science at the federal level. Now, imagine that you are one of the scientists at, I'm again from East Tennessee. My dad was at Oak Ridge National Lab. Imagine you're at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. You've got a nice grant from the NIH. You've got your publication. How much time do you dedicate to fulfillment on the data management and sharing policy? You're not going to get a tenure change because of whether or not you do it. You might or might not get citations, right? There is some evidence that you'll get citations. There's also some evidence that you could just do that on the phone, right? And that collaboration is what matters, not the actual data set posted. There's very little teeth to these policies, right? And so we've gone from make the paper open to make the data open, the code open, the paper open, and all these things. But it's like, you talk to someone and they say, well, I spent 3 months writing my paper and I spent 2 hours getting my code ready and then I just dumped it into a repo because all I needed to do is have a link. And again, this is fine if you're looking for one person who might find your data and read it. But if we're talking about forming foundation models that we train on this kind of data, the variability in the lab, the variability in the data curation and annotation introduces errors that are profound into the model as you build them from the data up. And so one of my favorite papers that won an Ig Nobel Prize is on uncooking an egg, right? Because once you have scrambled an egg and denatured the proteins in an egg, it's very hard to undo that. And so it's a very complex process involving certain kinds of chemicals so that you can refold the egg white as you go, right? But that's what you're doing when you're assembling a fundamental training set out of data that is coming from individual deposits and choices. And I spent a lot of my life in the commons and open movement. And most of those movements are based on the idea that individual choices can create large enough corpuses of culture, of science, of data that are valuable, right? That create public goods through individual choices. And I've come to believe that it's uncooking an egg compared to other ways that we might create those data sets. And so what I'm trying to do at Astera is to think about designing public data for scientific computing and machine learning. And design is a really good verb here, because what we've been doing is backing out whatever data is available that sort of emerges as a form of collective action from our scientific choices, as opposed to saying, what models do we want? What questions do we need answered, and what data would create those? And then we worry less about what happens secondarily to those data sets as they move on and about. But we start with saying, what if machine learning is the first user? I chose these two articles. These are both just from the Nature world, just from the last 6 months. You can throw a rock in Google Scholar and hit a paper that says, in order to do what we're going to do, we are missing data. October 14th, right? So pretty recent stuff, right? And what they're saying is in the geosciences, we've spent a lot of time in the first 3 of the paradigms. We're observing things empirically. We're doing some theoretical work, and we're doing minimal levels of simulation. We do some of that in earth science. We do some of that in air sciences. What we really need to do is do data-driven discovery of governing equations, because the governing equations that are coming out of the first 3 paradigms don't work anymore. The more data we discover, the more we realize the equations we have don't explain enough. They don't predict the world enough. We need to use a bottom-up approach. Right? It's the exact same article, right, on drug discovery. And it's a really interesting pattern that when you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Which is that in each of these fields, none of the work that we've been doing for 15 years in open science has led to the right data sets to do machine learning. And so, this is one of those things where just keep doing more of the wrong thing is not going to get there. And so my favorite Reddit comment on the Uncooking the Egg paper is that it would be easier not to cook the egg in the first place. So that's what we can do if we say, let's build the data first. Right? We decouple it from the research industrial complex. We talk to the users. Right? This is no more different. It's not that much different from peer review, except you do it at the beginning. Right? And you do it as a user research process, not a consensus-based process that sort of mashes you down. Because you go and talk to a diverse range of users who all need the same data set, maybe in multiple application domains. And you say, what format do you need? What data do you need? Right? What cadence do you need that data at? How much compute are you going to need to train a model? Do you already have a model? Is the model biased? Can we adjust the bias with intentional data creation? This is what it means to design for scientific discovery. And when you decouple from paper writing, it also gets easier to actually get the data because you move into data as a procurement problem as opposed to data as a research problem. So life sciences, which is where I've spent most of my life, there are these companies called contract research organizations or CROs. They're basically labs for hire. They have people, they have equipment, they have biosafety level 3 and up that you need to go to, and you can say, here's a bunch of bugs, right? Single-cell eukaryotes, algae, fungus. Please sequence them for me and send me the data at the following resolution. They send you a bill and they send you the data. You can put machines into those laboratories that do other kinds of mechanisms and run workflows that say, just generate me this data in a continuous form, standardized at a minimum quality level, and you can withhold payment if they don't do it. It's way easier than giving the money to an elite research institution and waiting for them to deposit it after they publish their paper. And you get that continuity. It's never going to be perfect. Every lab is variable, but the same lab running the same workflow on the same kind of cell over and over again is about as low of a variability as you can achieve. And what you get out at the other end is machine learning valid data sets. And it's not just in the life sciences. So this is a picture of a ground-based sensor array from NCAR, which is the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado. There's a lot of these networks that are capturing data about the real world, right? Biology, chemistry, earth, air, water. Right? None of those things are turning into machine learning data sets. And actually, if you go to the NCAR database, they only have 500 or so projects available in the data set. Right? There's way more than 540 projects that we funded over time. And so in one case, we might actually hire a lab to do it. In another case, we might go and say, can we just buy the data for you and publish it? Right? You've already got it. Can we buy it? Right? And this is something that only philanthropy can do. This is really hard for the government to do. The government, I think, can maybe follow us in this. But to show how easy this is, to show how much more ROI you get, dollar per bit, I think it's something that philanthropy is uniquely positioned to do. So a few overarching concepts. So if we decouple the data generation from paper writing, right, I think I've tried to establish that as we've gone. But I think this concept of data sets that, if created and made public, support multiple application domains. So take something like, again, tiny little single-cell organisms like algae, fungus, single-cell eukaryotes, right? So a eukaryote has a nucleus, prokaryote doesn't. We've got a lot of prokaryote data and a lot of multi-cell organism data. We don't have a lot of single-cell data with nuclei. It's a hole in the system, right? And it's biasing the existing foundation models to the point that when you go talk to someone who builds a foundation model in evolutionary biology, they say it's completely biased by E. coli and human. Right? And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's actually not that much of one when you dig into it. And we're at a point now for a single cell, if you take this procurement angle, you're looking at less than $10,000 per cell to get a complete genetic map of that. And it's going to take about a week. And to do the rest of the stuff where you save the phenotype, right, the function of the cell, again, there are machines that you can automate and robots that you can run that can do this in a workflow process. And what you might find is then, so you can do drug discovery on the data set, you can do soil chemistry if you're in the agricultural industry, you can do antibiotic resistance off the same data set. And so that multiplicity you get from doing the design work means that you can have, again, a bigger and bigger impact as you go. And again, we're not the only one thinking of this. Tom and Renaissance have done a lot of work in this space, and there's tons of room to run. What's great about it is it's not a competitive space because there's so many places we need data to support foundation modeling that it's a really interesting place to hit. Another part of this that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't been involved in industry, where you're actually trying to build a data product, not just the raw data that comes out of the sequencer, but a set of arrays, a sets of things that are built into the kinds of formats that machine learning scientists use by default. If you can actually publish those as data products that can be sideloaded straight into your cloud, instead of having to download a data set from here, and a data set from here, and a data set from here, and a data set from there, and compile them yourselves, then you get to the point where once you've actually done some sequencing, you can publish it as a data file, and then that day, everyone's models get better. And if you really want to spin the flywheel up, you actually pay for the compute. You say, our data lives here, and you can bring your model here and run it, and you don't have to pay for compute. But it's that concept of you're designing the data first for the machine learning model, and then you syndicate the underlying raw data to all the places where the US government stores data on your behalf. So if you're building genetic data, the US government will store it for you. RefSeq will store all your genetic data for you. They'll be happy to do it. And you don't have to worry about long-term sustainability preservation. So it's this concept of, again, you've built for the specific, and then your generic is happening by leveraging existing public infrastructure. Now, you can do all of this and nothing will happen sometimes, right? If you've done it right, ideally there are people who are already building models and they're there, but maybe no one's built yet because there are no models to build because there's no data to build on. And so if you really want the flywheel going, you actually have to think about the community. And so there's a couple of ways that this can be done. I'm a big fan of benchmarking. So this concept of benchmarking is you run a contest not to find out who's got the best model or by one point or this point. You want to find out what are the most important features of any model in the space. And we build a consensus benchmark model where we say, if your AI model can't outpredict this, don't even show up. And it's a filtering mechanism that is not peer review, but that acts as a major piece of quality control in machine learning. And going back to the protein example I showed in the Nobel Prize that just came out, the critical assessment of the structural prediction of proteins contests created the field. Because up until then, everyone said, you didn't just make your own model, you made your own assessment. And everyone's model, it's like the Lake Wobegon problem. Everyone's model is above average when you make your own assessment. When you have a community-based benchmark, it's really hard to hide. And once you've done that, then you can start to put out prizes that say, how far can you get towards the ceiling? Companies then come in and say, how far can we get towards the ceiling? Which is why DeepMind got into the space, right? And so if you put these four things together, there's a potential flywheel you can build in data using the public data sets. And that's what we're trying to do here. So one of our most important principles, and we just wrote our principles, values, mission, and everything this week, right? We are building the plane as we fly it. But one of the most consistent things we've got is that our value is to do the experiment. So if we believe this, we've got to try to do it. And so what you're going to see coming out from us in 2025 is, 1, 2, 3 of these, where we're trying to actually identify places where the models are biased or broken because of knowable data gaps and fill them. And then we'll see, do the models get better on day one? Can we syndicate those data to places where they can be sustained over time beyond us? And then do we stimulate secondary reuse through these community works? And if you want to talk to me about doing one of these, if you have an idea, please, please email me. Thank you.